So I want to get at something I've been dancing around with my entire baseball archive. And this is where, for me, the baseball intersects with philosophy, science, psychology, world history, world literature. Because I'll evoke the Milton quote again, where he talks about the fifth essence or the soul being imbued or embodied in a text or a book. And he's describing the nature or the character or the essence, the spirit of the being, which is being incarnated into this ulterior form. It's being projected outward into an object or an object phenomenon, which then itself has the character of the being written into it, literally, in terms of the text. And so when we think of the book, we're also thinking of the gene and the genome. We're thinking of the script of the human being written linguistically into existence from the character of being itself in a grand cosmological metaphysical sense. So the title for this one would be Strange Faces, Human Compression in the Photographic Mode as a Way of Being. And the photograph I'm going to use here to keep with my love and fascination and enjoyment with baseball culture and baseball history, is a 1888 Orotone photo of Jocko Flynn by Goodwin & Co., which was eventually used in the Old Judge baseball cards. So this is a complex thing. This is a complex phenomenon because I'm going to break down that title, Human Compression in the Photographic Mode as a Way of Being. You're looking at the photograph as a literary device or an inscriptive device of the nature or the essence of the human being, which bottles that essence or attempts to bottle that essence. Specifically, early studio portraiture, which in baseball terms and baseball history is most remarkably known by Carl Horner, whose photos ended up being interpreted by various different significant baseball card series, including the T206s, the portraits. But also the early Victorian mode of the photograph in terms of families or individuals sitting for the pose of portraiture. And this includes early baseball players and the Old Judge studio photography of baseball players in various different positions and characterizations being used. And what's fascinating to me and what drew me to this specific piece, to use this as the visual example, is the character of the face on Jocko Flynn and the position that's being taken, which really makes him appear to be a pitcher. The cap is tilted down over his eyes, and there's this almost like trepidatious expression of an animal looking back at something that doesn't really see him. And this is crucial and critical to me about what technology is and represents at the onset of modernity and the onset of industrialization. Because we're looking at, for the first time, a true mirror. And through that true mirror, in a purely representational sense, again, we're just talking phenomenologically, a mirror, right? A mirror that flattens dimensional perspective. A mirror that draws out image from total reality. It draws out image from essence, if you understand this. This is a way of thinking, and this is a way of being, because it's a representational mode that is flattening interdimensional reality, quantum mechanical reality, and even Newtonian reality, if you were going to drill it down dimensionally into 4 dimensions and 3 dimensions. We're talking about a total essential discourse which is ongoing as in nature, that is being, through technology, phenomenologized down into essential dimensions. You can think of this in terms of the letter as a symbolic device. And this is the history of images as symbolic devices. They function as mirrors that compress information down interdimensionally. And so this is what I mean by human compression, is really we're looking at the emergence of the photographic mode as really the call sign of industrialization. This is the media generative philosophical device, it's the true function of industrialization, which is to condense, distill, essentialize, draw down, make into symbol, as in a symbolic register. And again, you could think of the invention of alphabets as one of the first methods of industrialization, as well as cave paintings. So I'm going to draw this all the way back to the idea of industrialization as condensing essential information with speed, efficiency, and register into code, into a codex, or codifying reality into a symbolic scripture of being, which is meant to be representative. And I did some pretty significant research on this in terms of the concept of iconomachy, which is the overthrowing of image registers, which themselves are the codes and codexes of civilizations. The idea of defacing an icon or defacing an idol is to deface that which the civilization worships, and worship is simply a linguistic device of projecting and portraying value in space-time. This is all a reflection of consciousness. It's a reflection of the status of consciousness, and the human encounter with the photograph, or the photographer, the studio photograph, particularly with the massive mechanical industrial photographic devices with very, very, very long frame capture times, are themselves an encounter, man's first encounter with a machine that is seeing him. Right? So this is basically an encounter with an alien, if you understand this, because the alien is interpreting the human register and compressing down the dimensional interface of the human being into 2 dimensions. It's compressing it down into a flattened image. It's flattening the space of the human being and thus flattening the character into a single portrayal of that moment in a contrast of the chemical rendering of the script of the light upon the photographic paper. And so, in many ways, when we're discussing this process, we are discussing the instantiation of the death of the human being. And this is a deeper death than Marx talks about in his critiques of industrialization and factory and machine, because when he's talking about factory and machine, he's talking about the union of man and machine. He's talking about man becoming machine in many ways. Here, we are talking about man becoming alienated symbolically by the method of the photograph, the advent of the photograph. And this directly mirrors the profoundly existential hyperacceleration of that condition today, which is to say 150, a little over 150 years later, with the onset and onslaught of artificial intelligence, because we're talking about a technology created by man which turns man into a symbol, which distills man into an image device, which distills man's entire character, which is to say his essential character in space and time, which is necessarily transcendental of space and time, as a spiritual condition, as a quantum mechanical condition, as a consciousness condition, as a creational device and force not separate from the organizing powers of the universal, which is to say the creation of the cosmos, that man himself is a scalar or a fractal representation of the cosmos and a distillation of the powers of the cosmos. It is a rending and rendering of man from the embodiment, that literal embodiment as an unbroken present, into a form of symbolic representation, and thus creating a symbolic chain. And so this is what man naturally seeks to do in interpreting world, right? Because this is the realm of logic and concept. This is the realm itself which is made possible by the biological evolution of the forebrain device and devices, which are interpretive, reflective, rationalizing, cognizing, thinking back upon time, thinking back upon experience, and ordering it. And so this in itself, that biological revolution is the first break, which again is a technological break of man from time into reflective space. The capacity to reflect. And so then from there you have the entire history of philosophy, world philosophy, insofar as it can be remembered historically, as well as world literature, as well as world art, because we've created, and what has been created through us, right? Again, this is a simultaneous creational process, which is entirely universal. There is no boundary really there. What we've created and what we've created through us is the symbolic dimension. It is the ulterior dimension. And it's the schizophrenic break between the dream world and the world of the real, which is to say the embodied, incarnate world, which is entirely enfleshed. There is a trouble there, right? An existential trouble with the boundary between the symbolic dimension and the entirely real, incarnate, embodied, present immediacy of life and being and time, which is necessarily fluid, infinite, and itself almost an effortless natural process in which the organism is entirely subsumed, created, remade, subsumed, created, remade. And again, this is an interstellar phenomenon that's replicated across scales. This is the basic physics and existential physics of stars. So we're talking about, and this is where it gets interesting, right? And so this is why all of my work is on industrialization and early modernization, because this is where it gets interesting. When the technologies themselves become these alien robotic devices that are reflecting and refracting this previously unbroken agrarian, prelapsarian natural consciousness as an entirely threaded framework of being, which resides from star to animal to plant to human to solar system. These technologies that emerge by and through the hand of the human, which are the Frankensteinian. And they are the Frankensteinian in the sense that they are created as a metal. They're from the elements of the natural form. They're pieced back together like Osiris and Dionysus. They're resurrected from the primordial ground of the earth. We're talking here about precious metals. We're talking about lithium. We're talking about the man's metal age or chromatic age, industrial age consciousness, which is taking these elemental figures, these forces within nature that are swirling in this kind of fulminating, recombinating alchemical beaker of the earth and of the cosmological systems, all of which are composed of these elements, right? These chemicals, these molecular compounds that are interacting in space-time. But man is reaching his hand into this natural unconscious process of gravitational pulls, this process which is being synthesized without prime interlocutor, so to speak. And what I mean by interlocutor is quite literally man reaching his hand into the cosmos and transfiguring actively to produce substances. And this is beyond sexual reproduction or the consumption of food or the finding of water. If you understand, this becomes radically outside. This is a way of creating an ulterior reality, in that we understand the creation of the personal computational device or the computer chip or the cell phone or the camera or the photograph. This is a radical chemical elemental compound interaction which is being actively created by man to produce ulterior realities. And what's so fascinating about the three of the devices that I just named there, when we're talking about these forms of technology, is that they are image creating, image manufacturing, image transforming devices that rely on the codification of light through chemical and elemental interactions within a technological, I'll say chromatic, and when I say chromatic, I mean metal. It's a metallurgy. The same way that the alchemists, the medieval alchemists and the ancient alchemists spoke of the metallurgy, which is turning lead into gold. This is a deeply spiritual, consciousness-based process of image work, which is consciousness alteration and transformation through the distillation of essential natural presence, which is to say the totality of the cosmos, the unbroken human being psyche within the grand cosmological whole in an intergalactic sense. This is an unbroken synthetic process. It's a holistic process. But the break in the schism, the schizophrenia from nature, occurs in the development and advent of the forebrain and then is hyper-accelerated in industrial modernity. Hyper-accelerated through the creation of these, I'll say specifically image-based technologies, which radically reconform and reconfigure man's image of himself as in a reflection upon that which he is. And this is a form of technological terror in that it's a sublime revelation of the possibility of capturing life which is not life. And again, I'm alluding to this is so deeply ensconced in the concept and idea of Frankenstein as articulated by Mary Shelley. Because we're talking about a radical evolution that is occurring within a natural biological species context where the species is actively reorganizing the chemical synthesis, the molecular and elemental synthesis of nature. And this goes deeper into stuff like atomic fission, right? So stuff like splitting the atom or creating the atom bomb, right? Where the atom bomb and the photograph themselves as technological devices and innovations are deeply intertwined. Because, again, we're talking about taking the essential elements of nature and refixing them in man's image of the possible creation. And you can see Mary Shelley's primary argument is the danger and destruction that Frankenstein takes upon himself by making this technological device of the monster or the creature. And what she's really describing here is the hubris of man in relation to understanding the forces of nature through physics or through science and recombinating them through this kind of creational experimental force which we can just call technology. There's a deep danger in depicting the buffalo and the Lascaux caves. If you understand this, there's a deep danger in the lithium mines which create the cell phone devices. Because we've broken away from primordial time, which is the entire interlocution of the species with the cosmos. And you could say whatever you wanted to in terms of a value judgment about that, but I'll just elucidate. This is all a product of the hyperacceleration that is created in the advent of the forebrain as a natural biological evolutionary process. So you have to ask yourself this in terms of like the stepping up of stages evolutionarily from the unconscious mind of the cosmos, which is actively recombining sources and forces within this great beaker of the universal whole. And it not only creates man through this system of applied forces, but then furthermore creates the forebrain of man through this progressive system of applied forces, which allows for the interpretive, reflective thought, which breaks time as in a fluid, unbroken, primordial unity of the animal with God, so to speak, or the animal with the universal. And so when you have John Milton writing Paradise Lost, when he writes Paradise Lost, you're looking at this understanding that's emerging, and it's emerging progressively through industrialization and the industrializing world, the mechanizing world, that man has left that Garden of Eden, which is the unbroken consciousness and that kind of ensouled unity with nature, which we think of as particular to the animal state of consciousness. That man has broken from that in this evolution of the forebrain and reaching his hand into the technological code of nature and rearranging its alphabet to form a new language and a new word, which is the camera or the robot or artificial intelligence, right? Or the cell phone. These are all devices, when broken down to their constituent parts, are radical reconfigurations of nature. And this is what I mean by technology as a hyperacceleration. And then when you bring the camera as a reflection upon the conditions of nature into existence, this is a hyperspace leap. It's an exponential leap from the court painting of centuries and generations past. And because what this means is that there is no longer the luxury of the human eye to interpret reality. The human eye may direct the impulse of the camera, but the lens of the camera itself is capturing an imagistic representation of the interdimensional, interspatial reality of the human being and rendering it a glyph, rendering it a symbol, condensing down the expressive power and character and force of the will as incarnate in any aperture or frame that the eye of the camera is turned towards, and must mirror it back to degrees of faithfulness, of course, right? Because the camera itself is an artisanry and an artistry in terms of not only how the photograph is captured, but how it's developed chemically upon the page. It must render that which is. And by rendering that which is, it rends it down, much in the way that fat is rendered. The human being is being broken apart in this evolutionary process, which is simultaneously, as we're describing here, biological and mechanical in a profoundly unbroken way. Because the advent of the forebrain and the advent of the camera are themselves mutually reflective devices upon the condition of nature. And that reflection creates a refraction. It's a dissembly. And so in this photograph here, with this expressive condition, as well as the shielded cap and the turned shoulders and the compressed arms and the turned away body, we're looking at man reluctantly facing and moving toward the object of his creation, which is inhuman. It is no longer human. It's an alphabet which is being translated through a morphic alien code. It's a form of consciousness which itself has a mind of its own, in the sense that it's been delocated and dislocated from the human consciousness, which has assembled it from the ground of nature. This is precisely why the camera is perhaps the earliest inheritor, in a technological modernity sense, to artificial intelligence. Because we're looking at this first encounter, and when we look at these early images, so here it's 1888, copyright, Goodwin and Company, we're looking at man's encounter with the alien. And so this is what's meant by alien, right? If we just distill the common parlance of the term, it's extraterrestrial, which is beyond the terra or outside of the terra. And the terra is the realm of the human experience. We're talking about the fleshly or the earthly, the grounded within the incarnate impulses and expulses of the human experience. And so this is both technology and science. It reaches out into the world to understand it in its constituent parts and components, and how it's formed and it's assembled, and at its highest, as in Heraclitus, to understand its essential character. What technology is a direct consequence of scientific revolution and evolution. And scientific revolution and evolution is a direct consequence of the advent of the forebrain. So everything that we see emergent from scientific and technological revolution is first, a priori, emergent from the biological revolution and evolution of the brain. This is the strange face and the strange force of consciousness which is acting through man, creating through man an ulterior reality. A reality which is superhuman, extra-natural, broken from this, again, the prelapsarian Garden of Eden state of primordial consciousness, which hitherto man understands the history of Earth and the cosmos insofar as he can see in the year 2025, to create this strange fiction, which is a schizophrenic break. First, in the creation of the forebrain, which is a reflection upon life, world, the reality, the self, which is also the development of the creation of the self-concept, which is the morphic way in which the human being perceptive and perceptual device attempts to situate itself within the cosmos. And so nature, to this point, would be self-situated. It is self-situated entirely within the drives it constructs within the biological organism. It is entirely contained within nature. This is the idea of an ensouled cosmos. And the reason that this idea, which is an ancient concept, no longer resonates with modernity is that we have moved in terms of our understanding of what has occurred, even in the concept and process and procession of thought and the human mind, from this unbroken, you could almost call it a primordial matriarchal consciousness, the ensouled nature, the ensouled earth, the unbroken time of the present, into the fracture which is paradise lost, as articulated by John Milton, in a consciousness-based sense, which is Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden by eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, which is to say, the perceptual beaker and beacon being burst open through the experience of reflective mind. And in that process, it's a sort of Pandora's box, that there has been a recursive linguistic knowledge that it has emerged naturally from the unconscious and subconscious substratum of recombinative evolutionary technological nature, which itself is always already occurring as a systems process at the level of the cosmos. That this has emerged, and as such now is tinkering with the device. And this is everything from genetic code alteration to cloning to the splitting of the atom, right, to the creation of the computer and the cell phone. These are all the same thing. And they're all emergent from the same thing, the same principle. So when you have this compression that occurs and is occurring, it's occurring first through the evolutionary biological advent of the forebrain, and then down through the progressive revelation of what exactly these powers of reflective, refractive, analytical consciousness are in terms of the breaking of time. This is first and foremost an innovation and a revelation of the breaking of the infinite as a primordial experience of the animal into a fractured experience of time as a reflective disjuncture in the mind of mankind. And so this is being progressively replicated through history as a technological revelation, which is itself philosophy and science, which is then being incorporated into the consciousness, the species-level consciousness of mankind, as in technology. And then when you have this outcropping and outburst of early modern industrial revelation, particularly in the photograph, you have man's confrontation with the creation, which has emerged naturally, as in from nature, the capacity, much again in the way of Frankenstein, to incorporate and reincorporate fragmented parts which have emerged from this shattering of the mind. I think this is called today the bicameral mind, the shattering of the mind into perspectival dimensions which are in dialogue with one another, which time has now become this memory of eternity, which is now experienced as man's reflective capacity upon nature. And this is the separation of nature, which Marx describes as alienation in his industrial texts. But this is something that has occurred long before Marx and long before industrialization. And the industrial modern consciousness is a embodied revelation, as in practice, incorporation of the scientific method, which is born from this schizophrenic break, which occurs in the evolutionary biology of the species itself into the forebrain. It's born from this break in time, which is in the nature of mankind as an evolutionary species, bottled into the scientific revelations which eventually emerge into man reaching into nature, pulling out and extracting lithium and making the computer. This is it's a chain of events. It has to be seen at this grand time scale level. Otherwise, it will be misunderstood, misinterpreted. And this moment of revelation that occurs at the turn of the 1900s in the 20th century is the turn of man turning about to face the consequences of this grand primordial action of hundreds of thousands of years. The grand primordial action of the advent of the forebrain and the forebrain progressively revelating its powers. This is the first break. It's the first paradise lost. It's the first true leaving of the Garden of Eden, and it's occurring as and in the mind, as and in the technology of the brain. And this is again, it's a consciousness technology. It's a synaptic technology. It's a wiring technology of the system of mankind to perceive in certain capacities, to orient itself in certain ways toward the cosmological whole. And so this is what's so fascinating to me about this image, is that animal trepidation. It's that animal fear, the sublime encouragement of the realization of man's technology, which is the forebrain technology, in the Frankensteinian monster of the camera, which is now no longer in the hands of Victor Frankenstein, but instead now roams free and reveals what it will reveal in its compression and condensation of nature, which is necessarily a progressive revelation. It's a progressive revelation as in a distillation of energy, a distillation of information, a quantification of time. And what I mean by quantification here is that this is a chemical outcropping to represent time. And as such, it is condensing and compressing it. And just as it's condensing and compressing time, it's condensing and compressing man. And so you see this aesthetically in modernity and the radical changes and shifts that human being wears the clothes of its existence in every way. This is culture itself as a whole, in entirety. The clothes that the human being wears in existence. It is now you have this cultural term. It's like the cyberpunk is a great term. It's being thrust and shifted into an ulterior world, and human being and humanity itself making the leap. Making the cosmic leap out of nature into the technology of that which it has created, which has rendered nature a technological code, a system of elemental and chemical factors which can be actively combined to produce certain outcomes, which is itself the experimental, practical, scientific method of understanding the component parts in the exploded engine of the mechanism of the grand cosmos. And this is a force. This is a force of hundreds of thousands and millions of years, which is moving through the human being and moving through the human experience, which reaches the pinnacle of the revelation of its powers at this early onset of modernity, particularly through the advent of the photographic camera, because none such device in early modernity reflects upon man in such a literal, metaphysical, metaphorical, imagistic way as the camera, as the photographic instrument. Man is no longer in charge of the interpretive framework of his life. It is being rendered before him in the technological eye. And so you see it in the face of the subject of this photo. It's the sense of being overpowered, overdrawn by a force of nature, which is supernatural. Overdrawn by the hand of that which man has created. And the primordial terror, which is visualized as trepidation, of this thing which itself is an apex predator dimensionally. And what I mean by apex predator dimensionally is, again, it's a distillation of the full spectrum, the interdimensional truth and nature of existence, into a symbolic realm, into a symbolic code and mechanism. And we see the necessary consequences of this in and upon the modern consciousness and in modernity, with the obsession with the photographic image as a lens of truth, and not only a lens of truth, a lens of the distillation of character. And the attempt to depict value, meaning, truth, power through the lens of the camera, just as it was in the high courts of old, with the painter as the one who is interpretive and interpreting. So that's what I got here. I'll catch you on the next one.